This week's episode is supported by Nikon USA, whose latest camera is the Z8. Its compact design and user-friendly form factor are combined with state-of-the-art autofocus and sensor technology, making it an ideal tool for any photographer producing stills, video, or both. Whether you're upgrading from an older DSLR or making the step up to a full-frame sensor, find out how the Z8 can transform and elevate your photography by visiting nikonusa.com/podcast Z8. We also have the support of the Charcoal Book Club. Their carefully curated selections reflects the best in contemporary photography, and all for a reasonable price. And they are delivered directly to your doorstep each month. They offer free shipping to the US, Canada, and the UK. It's subsidized elsewhere. It's a great way to begin or expand your photo library. Join the club at charcoalbookclub.com today, and remember to use the promo code TheCandidFrame at checkout. My brother went on a recent cleaning tear in our family home. As a result, he found a treasure trove of photographs that we hadn't seen in decades. At his birthday party, he had collected them into small albums, and family and friends, we went through them, sharing the wonderful memories that those photographs held. It was especially interesting to see the neighborhood as it had been. The used car lot that became a church, a gas station that turned into a strip mall. You know, it's one thing to remember places in your mind, but it's another thing to see them immortalized in photographs. Photographer Barbara Mensch, decades ago, documented her neighborhood, the lower south side of New York, the location of the original Fulton Fish Market, a place that at one point in its history was the source of the majority of fish consumed in the United States. It was a place that was fully alive when the rest of the city was sleeping, filled with truckers, dock workers, and a few wise guys. Her images document a historic place that was defined not just by what people did, but who they were. This is Ibarian X, and welcome back to The Candid Frame. Oh, welcome, Barbara. It's great to have you on the show.
Great to be here.
It's a great book. Yeah, I love talking to people about, of course, their personal projects, and especially people who've dedicated long periods of time to it. But this subject of the Fulton Fish Market, it's interesting photographically, historically, but it's such a wonder to look at.
Yeah.
Because I think everybody knows about the market, yet to have this kind of immersion is kind of rare. And the fact that, considering how challenging it was to photograph there, especially when you first started in the 80s, it's no surprise that there's not an abundance of photographs of it like there might be of Times Square.
Yeah.
But what drew you to wanting to make photographs there in the first place?
Well, it's very easy to answer that question because I moved into the area. And at the time, in the early 80s, it was pretty much a no man's land. It was isolated, out of the way in terms of where it was situated in relation to the rest of New York. It was not very populated, if we're talking specifically about the southern waterfront, but that also has to do with the whole lower Manhattan in general, all the way down to the World Trade Center and Battery Park. It was not very populated, period. And in my area in particular, there were pioneer artists that had moved into the abandoned warehouses, but a lot of these old warehouses were still in use because at night they opened up and became the Fulton Market, which, by the way, was at one time, up until they got ousted by Mike Bloomberg in 2005, was the largest seafood hub in the Western Hemisphere, generating approximately, factually, I'll be as concise as I can, at least $1 billion in revenue, at least per year. The largest market in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, and up until, I think, from what I was reading, up until the 50s and 60s, that the great majority, if not 75 or 80% of the fish that was consumed by the country came through that market, which is remarkable to think about, that all of that fish coming through that one location.
And it was an all-cash business. And there were no computers. And it was all cash in the middle of the night. Okay, so there you go. Think about that. And no police. There are no police.
Yes, you can only imagine what was happening.
Oh,
which we'll get into.
Okay.
But one of the fascinating things about it is that, a lot of people, when they talk about taking on a project, there are a lot of different obstacles that are involved in being able to do it. We're not even talking about technical stuff. It's just about logistics. And one of the obvious problems was just being able, especially as a woman during that time, to go in and photograph. But the one thing I wanted to talk to you about first is, because of the nature of that market, life there starts at about 1 or 2 in the morning. Yeah. So for a lot of reasons, that's enough for most people to say, oh no, I'll find something else to go and photograph. Right. Much less getting up at midnight to go and photograph in a smelly place at 1 or 2 in the morning. But that didn't seem to be an issue for you, huh?
Well, when you have obsessions, the hours that you work become secondary. And I am very much a day person. So, changing my lifestyle to work all night was certainly a big change for me. But what I did learn by staying there for as long as I did was that, human beings in general are diurnal. They work and, prepare, eat during the day, they do their activities, all humans, and many animals. And at night, you rest. In this case, it was all topsy-turvy. And I really think psychologically that affected the way people behaved. Certainly in the nighttime brings out certain kinds of characteristics in one's personality, or let me phrase this in a better way. Because it's at night, there are certain behavioral patterns that may come out of a person that normally you wouldn't expect to see during the day.
When you first started photographing there was a lot of resistance that you met, because here you come, here's a photographer coming in, starting to make pictures, where photographers usually don't come to make photographs. So tell me about finding a way in so that you can make the photographs and not get run out.
Well, in order for me to answer that, I really have to give you some background into this whole situation. Of course, over the years, there have been many photographers who have gone down to South Street and, spent a few hours trying to capture some images. But what I quickly learned, and particularly as a resident, that the Fulton Market in itself was self-regulated, and they only had a certain amount of hours to push their product and to make their money. So anyone who had no business there was not welcomed into this whole group of people trying to conduct business. So that was an obvious thing. So if you were going to put yourself in the middle of a very serious place where goods are exchanged for thousands and thousands of dollars, and you only have a few hours to make that money, then you have to be mindful of that and respectful of that. So that was the first thing I had to deal with. But more, I guess, for the general public, what's really more important to understand is that in the early 80s, the mayor of New York City, Mayor Koch, decided that the waterfront needed a new facelift. And in order to do that, they had to somehow make peace with the Fulton Market workers or get rid of them. And this is something that New York has been trying to do for a while, since the boats became less and less, bringing the catch into the different piers adjoining the East River in the shadow of the Brooklyn Bridge. So, remarkably and coincidentally, at the same time that the mayor decided to invite the Rouse Corporation to redevelop the waterfront and create a mall on the East River, Rudolph Giuliani, who was then federal prosecutor, he was not yet mayor, but he had gone to war with the mob, wherever they were. The garment center, and, but the Fulton Market was one of his main targets. And he spent years in this crusade called Operation Sea Probe. And what that meant was that he would flood the market with all kinds of agents taking pictures from the FDR Drive or covertly driving by, indicting people wherever he could with the RICO laws, which are now big news with Donald Trump. He was the first to use that. A RICO law is about getting people involved in a syndicated criminal outfit where there's a group involved as opposed to one person. So for me, not having to learn what was going on with this aspect of the experience made it so difficult for me, because no one wanted me around. They thought I was a federal agent, and I was certainly I remember being attacked with chunks of ice. It was and of course threats to my life. But like any responsible artist and photographer, you become mindful of that, and it becomes a very slow process of trying to create and establish relationships, and over time prove, because who am I to just come into some place and assume that I can do what I want to do. So it was a very gradual process of sharing my work with them, actually bringing other photography books down to express, to try and share the love and the passion I had for the medium. And of course, in order for me to be there, I had to convince the wise guys that I was there to chronicle their lives as a historical document.
Yeah. And I think one of the things they came to sort of understand about, the Mafia, the mob's sort of influence on the fish market, it wasn't so much that they were in control of it, but that we're having to be paid off by the people who were there running their businesses in order to be able to function. And I think that's sort of that's right. And I think it's a misunderstanding that I probably a lot of other people had. So did you get a sense of how it worked in terms of the politics as a result of being there and hanging out with these people on a regular basis? Yes,
of course. I had to. I had to play ball with them. And one of the most important things was, here's a word you've heard a lot, out of respect, fear, whatever, I could not publish or share with anybody any of the work I was doing unless it went through certain people, certain men. And in one particular case, without his help, I could never have done this project ever. I used to call him my editor. And I'd say, well, this is what I got today. You want to have a look? And of course, sometimes because that was the agreement, even though it wasn't like we sat down and said, well, Barbara, you're going to do this and that. It's just a lot of things when you're dealing in this kind of element are unspoken. And God forbid you don't have any street smarts about you, because you could never pick up on the nature of their communication. So, in that regard, I had to share my interviews, my oral histories, which in this particular book, since it's not about the Fulton Market, I also published a book on that before. I just kept it to very simple statements. But I do remember one young man who we were actually at the locker room, that photograph that you love so much, where it says "fuck the corporation," and he started telling me about the legacy of his relatives who did, are main historical figures in New York, Cosa Nostra. And I remember, I wrote it all down, and it was fascinating, and I had to bring it to my editor, and boy, did he get angry, and he threw him out of the market. He lost his income. I felt terrible about that. God knows what else happened. I don't know. So yeah.
There was a bar there, the Paris bar.
Yes.
And Mikey, who was the bartender there, was one of your first friends that you made there. Tell me about him and what it was like to be in that bar.
Oh, my God. Well, thank God for Mikey, because you weren't allowed to photo. There are two bars. There are actually two waterfront bars, Carmine's in Paris. And no one with cameras could walk in there. They would throw them out or, do the classic thing, take the film out of the, give me the camera, pull the film out. Just remember, this is before digital photography. And, and it was the most compelling place for me. The fluorescent lighting and this beautiful hand-carved bar with this beautiful mirrors and the reflections and the tiles and the ambiance of the place with all of these longshoremen and unloaders, everyone with their grappling hooks and blood-stained aprons coming out of the fillet houses. This was like, you couldn't ask for a treasure trove of images. You as a cinematographer, as a photographer, it was for me the most compelling sight. However, I got thrown out like everybody else, and I did come back the following morning, and Mikey realized, because the building had just been sold, that he said, all right, come back when the wise guys aren't in here, and, just be fast. But at 9 o'clock in the morning, you still have the characters. You still have the old ship captains or Captain Clay, all these people, these men who used to actually have jobs on the waterfront, and they were living in the flop houses, and the Paris bar, by the way, had these small apartments, which up until World War II and past that became like these very, I don't know, what's the word, SRO apartments for people who are on minimal income, if not welfare. So a lot of these old men, these old timers, lived around in these abandoned warehouse, the warehouses where the fish guys stored, the ice machines and all of the produce, in the freezer that didn't get sold the night before. So it was, I'd be in there at 9 o'clock in the morning, and all these guys were drinking, and so I did the best I could to get those were my earliest photographs of the bar, of that place. And, till this day, it's my understanding that I'm the only one that has these images, they're I think so. I researched it myself, over and over. Paris bar. Nope. The only pictures, nothing,
Wow.
so, I don't know. So that's That's that. Mikey, by the way, these were, and the thing about, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the thing about these men is that they were classic New Yorkers. And Mikey, he would, I have these photographs, he would just hold his cigarette like Humphrey Bogart, in every movie which one was he in with Humphrey Bogart? Casablanca. And he'd have these gestures. They all did. They were classic. And a lot of times they reminded me of Damon Runyon characters because so many of them came out of the 30s and the 40s anyway, so.
It's really interesting, especially the portraits. The men in these photographs look like straight out of Central Casting.
I know, but they're not.
But they're real people.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is not just the way they look or the way they dress, but sometimes the body language.
Yes.
Like there's one like Vinny, the portrait of Vinny that's been like a really popular one on social media.
Yeah.
I mean, I saw that portrait and it was just like, I mean, he could have been a model. But
he was an unloader, for a wise guy company,
Right. But the body language was so expressive, and I think it was. I see that in a lot of the portraits that you made, and I think that what's really interesting is that I think these men had a certain comfort level with their own bodies that I think is rare, and I can't help but think that it was largely a result of the fact of how they use their body for work. That in order to do that kind of hard work, that you had to feel comfortable and be aware of your body in a way that most people who sit behind a desk never have to.
That's a really interesting observation. I didn't think of that, but in general, the men down there, I mean, they taught me a lot about survival, but many of them, and I'm talking more now, addressing more of the people who were in business, like the stand men, the salesmen, the men that ran these companies. Just remember, this was the early 80s, and all they had was their brains and their muscle. That's it. And I think when you are in an environment where you are so tested over and over again, every day, there's a certain kind of pride or self-assurance that you get from making money in the most dire of circumstances. And the fact that the waterfront was filled with floods and nasty weather, and the East River would ice up. And the only warmth you had were these fire barrels, glowing in the middle of the night. It brings you to think about your own life and what your own sense of struggle is, and what is the nature of survival, and what is this all about, this whole money-making thing. And of course, given what went on down there years ago, I'm not supporting anything that the Mafia has done, but look at where we are today. It makes their criminality pale in comparison. I don't know why I got off on that, but go ahead. Sorry.
That's fine. As you mentioned, Bloomberg started this gentrification that's, with the development of condominiums and all these other things, this development that started happening down there. But one of the more interesting images that you have in the book is because of its proximity to Wall Street. You have this picture of this guy in an attaché case and a woman in work clothes walking across there. And I thought, wow, what an incredible juxtaposition between these two different worlds, which couldn't be more different. Yet, man, they were literally overlapping each other. At least during that period of time.
Well, the commentary on that is that once I got really, really, really not comfortable, but I was there long enough and trying to understand that world enough to put myself in the position of a worker looking out on South Street, looking out on the market, and then by 7 o'clock, everything would start to change. Daybreak, people going to work, parking in the same areas that were used during the night for the customers to come with their vans to what we call loading zones, where you had one person directing and overseeing where the men, they were called journeymen, where they would bring the deliveries of fish from the stands, from the concessions, to the people who bought the fish, who usually showed up in these not tractor trailers, in vans or, large cars where they could put their crates of seafood. So once I started looking at the world through their eyes, these kinds of pictures became very clear to me, like, oh, this is what they're seeing. And just remember, many of the men down there, it was almost like a Eugene O'Neill play, The Hairy Ape. They had no education, zero. And a lot of the old timers that I photographed, who are long gone, they all lived in the area. This was the Fourth Ward. This is what Tammany Hall said. Boss Tweed set up in the 1800s. They lived in the shadow of the Brooklyn Bridge, and and their parents, or they had immigrated from mostly the Mezzogiorno in southern Italy. So Mezzogiorno meaning the middle of it, southern Italy and Sicily, and that ambiance, that was something that became very clear to me, that there was this thing about, I don't want to feel inferior to you because you have a fancy job. I'm making this money. I'm doing my work, and I can compete with you in the money in the money area. So
I imagine that as that gentrification started to happen, and that the prioritization was going to development and bringing in a different type of people into that area, that some of the anger was not just about the development, but somehow that their contributions were being diminished and devalued as a result of that, despite the fact that all the work, all the blood, all the, everything that they had done were as important to the development of the city, if not the country. And that somehow with this development, they were just being like, well, you're not important anymore.
Yeah, but they always felt like that. That was the nature of men that worked along the waterfront and doing these quote unquote menial jobs. They were always considered the lower rung of the societal ladder. If you had a job on the waterfront unloading a boat, who would pay attention to you, and so a lot of the experiences I had down there were trying to understand the justification. Oh God, this is like getting complicated. The justification for their criminality, stealing fish, for example, which was a big thing with Rudy Giuliani, the pilfering of fish from the tractor trailers and interstate commerce, you're tampering with. The fact is that they felt they weren't being respected. So if they were going to earn a few extra dollars to feed their family, that was their justification. And I put that in my introduction. I said, well, what do you think about, doing something bad? And Mikey would say, rob a corporation. They can swallow it. Why rob a guy that's got to feed his family? Yeah, it's a great quote. Yeah, right.
So as, Giuliani was using, the RICO laws in order to, tamp down on the mob's influence on the fish market. And then there's this development that's happening. Yeah. And so this whole lifestyle, this whole thing, in the 90s starts to change. Yeah. So you had already been photographing for a good amount of time, but how did photographically did you shift, if you shifted at all, in terms of the changing narrative and the story that was playing out?
Well, by the 90s, I was no longer down on South Street. That project I had, as one of my friends from Smitty Fillet's house used to say, Frank, he was brilliant. He says, well, when you start to hear the same stories again, or your pictures start to become repetitive, that's when you know you've done your story. This is a fishmonger telling me this. This isn't like, one of my mentors. These guys were so smart. They just knew it. I mean, they till this day, their lessons are in my head. So my lens obviously was focused on other aspects of Lower Manhattan and places that, I would routinely interact with, Canal Street, the Bowery, Tribeca. These are all streets I would walk as a local resident. And if you repeatedly walk in this environment, you begin hopefully to become sensitive to certain things. And in the section 2, each section I put quotes in from an urban historian or, someone that's interesting to me. So section 2 was about uncertainty and neglect. And where do we go from here? And I used a lot of photographs from the 90s that I shot to kind of illustrate that idea. And some of them become more documentary style. Some become more like metaphors for where we were, where I was as, because this project is really a personal timeline for me. In other words, I didn't photograph like the COVID epidemic because that affected everybody. That wasn't a Lower Manhattan issue. But we had floods, we had fires, we had arson, we had things that didn't work anymore. We used to have these beautiful clocks all over Broadway because the center of newspaper printing, as you were talking about, was by City Hall in Park Row. So all around that area are these gorgeous clocks, and they're made out of this wrought iron. They're gorgeous. And I would walk down these streets lots of times to pick up my son at school, and there was this one clock on Duane Street, and the numbers were faded, and the hands never moved. That's in the book. And I love that picture because to me, it represents the 90s. It was like, where do we go from here? And that was the beauty of looking back over this time period and seeing where the story was taking me personally.
The Nikon Z8 is a camera with the build and form factor that users of the legendary Nikon D850 have enjoyed and appreciated. But this camera is smaller and lighter, featuring the latest in sensor and autofocus technology to meet virtually any photographic need, including sports, wildlife, and portraiture. Whether shooting still, video, or both, the Z8 is meant to be the right tool for any occasion. Its 45.7 megapixel full-frame stacked sensor delivers rich detail and beautiful color. It features blistering fast and accurate autofocus, including subject detection, developed with deep learning technology. Its VR technology provides up to 6 stops of image stabilization when a tripod just isn't an option. It features internal 8K video and the ability to produce 120p at 4K. Its pro-grade construction features an eco-friendly carbon fiber chassis, premium weather sealing, a sensor shield, and dual card slots. So you'll enjoy a camera that delivers even under the harshest of circumstances. Learn more about the Z8 and how it can make a difference in your photography by visiting nikonusa.com/podcast Z8. The Charcoal Book Club is back as a sponsor and wants to share a special event coming in 2024. The Chico Review is an annual event that gathers photographers to celebrate their love for photography. It's more than just an opportunity to share your work and meet publishers and editors. It's a rare opportunity to be surrounded and immersed by a community that prioritizes photography and being a photographer. If you have never had such an experience, mark the date and register for the event scheduled for March 17th through the 24th in Prairie, Montana. Find out more by visiting chicoreview.com or charcoalbookclub.com. What I like about the work, and I think it's a really good point to make for people who are interested in photographing communities, is yes, you were in New York, but you were focused on a particular neighborhood in New York.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, when people think about, oh, of course you could be a good photographer in New York, it's just a city that's always alive, but there's something about focusing on a small area and not looking at it from an exotic point of view, because that invites a certain type of photographs.
Yeah, which are boring.
But when you're completely immersed into a space, when you're completely immersed in a space like you were, and you see things that other people will never see, like that clock, right? Because there's things that are invisible to most. And when you're carefully observing a space, a location, a neighborhood over and over and over again, things get revealed to you as a consequence of you looking that
Very
carefully.
True. Right.
And a lot of your photographs sort of speak to that, because you could have someone going in there, you know, a great photographer with expensive equipment, but that doesn't mean that they would see what you saw.
That's right. But you said something. What is a great photographer? Okay. We had Berenice Abbott and who else was there? What's his name? I can't remember right now. But the point is that Berenice Abbott, I'm using her as an example, focusing on one topic, and my mentor, of course, Bruce Davidson, who I learned a lot from our lengthy conversations. When you immerse yourself in a subject, so many things are revealed to you, and the learning, the experience goes both ways, you know. So for me, walking around the Bowery, going back and forth and up and down and going shopping, doing this, you see things, oh my God, like the Globe meat slicer store, you know, and realizing that the 90s was the slow transformation of that part of my neighborhood. The new museum got built, and that was the beginning of pointing to the Bowery as a new destination for the art world and for people to come and live beyond some of the pioneers that lived down there, like Robert Frank. You know, like nobody, you know, who lived in these places? Like, just, you know, you had to be like a nutty artist. You know, I need my space, you know, and that's all that mattered. You know, you just wanted a space to work. So the slow, gradual transformation is what was becoming revealed to me in my pictures. And they, you know, a lot of them I forgot I even had. So, you know, the Bowery now is almost, none of these places exist anymore. You know, cash register machine repair shops. You know, at Petrella's Point, some crazy guy who used to have a newsstand on the corner of Canal Street and the Bowery, and he used to paint stuff. And the cops would come and say, "Get rid of that signage." He'd always like paint. Oh, if you want to go to Orchard Street, and then he'd point the way, or, you know, like he'd have directions for people. Oh, by the way, if you want to buy a newspaper, you can buy one. But the point is, it was all this crazy stuff that was so much part of the character of the neighborhood. So how do you not photograph that? How do you not embrace the beauty of the idiosyncrasies of people and their habits and how they do business. And then came 9/11, and then everything changed again.
So how did you feel that accelerated what happened, the changes that happened?
Well, that was a very big political thing because people, the whole fear of everyone in Lower Manhattan is that nobody would want to live there anymore. That was it. Look, my place is right next to the Brooklyn Bridge. 5 minutes from our police station, our main police station, and the federal courts, and everything else, and Wall Street, and the World Trade Center. So you would think this is a terrorist target. Why stay? However, the remarkable thing that happened was that New York, that's why I put that Jane Jacobs quote in. She was one of the heroines of not only urban history, but really crusades against gentrification or the nature or trying to define gentrification. And she made this comment that really struck me, and it was about cities, that why is it that certain cities cannot, after tragedy and harm comes to them, revive or rejuvenate itself, and why is it that some do? So I thought that was very interesting. Like she referred to those kind of cities as dull and inert, and New York, our metropolis, is anything but dull and inert. So again, I had to force myself to go through these photographs, the ones that I took the day of the attack, which I never published. I never had any interest in doing anything about 9/11. It was just too horrible, and there were too many pictures out. But when I had a photograph, because I was home that day, I ran up to the roof, and I have that picture of the plane, the second plane, actually piercing through the trade tower. I didn't even look at them. So, I said, holy crap, But what we did in Lower Manhattan is that we came back, and the first test was Tribeca. And the fact that they created this walkway between West Street, which pretty much is closer to the Hudson, and Church Street, which is it's by Trinity, it's by one of the churches, and it's very close to Broadway. So all of a sudden people had a way to cut through the island, Lower Manhattan, that was central to where they could get to business, to, certain activities, to buying and selling. So, we also had some very key figures who lived in Tribeca, and that's Robert De Niro, who jump-started the Tribeca Film Festival. And remarkably, the real estate values held. They didn't go down, and people didn't leave in droves, as was predicted. And Mike Bloomberg put in place a tax incentive where you would be not required to pay taxes if you bought property. If you rented, the rents were kind of tweaked a little bit. So Lower Manhattan held, and Wall Street held, and we went on from there to slowly rebuild. However, what I did put in that book was, what is the nature of rebuilding, and where is this building boom going, and how many jobs and how many people have been displaced, and how much change is change. So,
one of the things that's kind of interesting about your work is the span of time. You got 3 decades. That you've photographed this location, and there's the matter of and now I'm drawing a blank on the word.
It's okay. Take your time.
Nostalgia. Nostalgia. That's the word.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, what role do you think that nostalgia plays in in your work? Because you weren't necessarily thinking about that when you make the photographs, but when you look at it now, and collectively you've put together several books, but what role does it play?
Well, I don't really, even though people might say, oh, look at this picture of the old blah, blah, blah. No, I don't consider it nostalgic. I just consider it, again, it's the same thing I thought about 25 years ago. When we destroy these institutions or, we move these little mom and pop shops out, what are we replacing it with? It's always, for me, the universal question. And that's the whole nature of the book. It's not like I said, well, gentrification is in blah, blah, blah. And, it's not about that. It's a rhetorical question. And that's why I end it with, these new buildings going up in Lower Manhattan. Some of them look quite absurd, in terms of the landscape of these old tenements, and then the last shot was actually I recently did this commission for the Howard Hughes and Jean Georges, the tin building. So I was up in the offices and going east to west, you see this, it's almost pulsating with skyline, and new buildings and glass and steel. I don't consider nostalgia, but other people might find it. I don't care what as long as you react to the pictures, I don't care. Instead of just going, oh, okay, next,
Yeah. You mentioned in your introduction about COVID, about that sort of led you to go back into your archive. Tell me about how that time influenced your return to the work and reconsidering it. Well,
it follows with the thing I just mentioned, and that was a few years ago. I was approached by this major real estate developer who yet again was going to develop the waterfront. We've had a succession of different developers coming in over the years and trying to, make a success of these mall projects. So Howard Hughes, which is a strange name, one of the largest real estate companies in America, just made yet another deal with the city and then brought in Jean Georges. He is our great celebrity chef, and they pumped gazillions of dollars into refurbishing or trying to rebuild the tin building. And of course, they had to level it first and then bring back certain elements of it. So they had asked me if I was interested in doing some kind of installation in the new building. And as a result, I had to go back into my archive because of a lot of logistical reasons. A lot of the photos I wanted to use, I couldn't use. So I had to keep digging and digging and digging. And lo and behold, I started to realize that this project that I was about to immerse myself in was a small sliver of the work that I had really done. And again, because you're going back in time. You're working with film and not digital, so it doesn't automatically come up on the screen. You're not downloading every phase of a photographer who worked with film. You have to be careful to scan and notate, and I'm not that great at it, or at least I'm getting better. So, I was just basically going through rolls of negatives and contact sheets and going, oh, yeah. Oh, I remember this walk through Tribeca when they were destroying all the artist lofts, So, these sometimes you find you're led in certain directions because of some other thing that calls you. One thing leads to another and another.
It's always an interesting journey to return to work that you haven't looked at in a long time.
Yes.
And you make some wonderful discoveries, and you go, I took that? That's actually really good.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, but what did you what did you discover about yourself as a photographer, especially when you looked at the earlier work?
Well, that's
what did you think of yourself as a photographer?
Oh my God! How could you? Oh God, you're putting me on the spot right now. How do I? Let me put it to you this way. When I was teaching at the ICP, I would tell these students, "Why do you want to do this? It's a miserable life. You're never happy with anything. You're always trying to get better and better and better, and in the end, you want your work to be somehow to touch people and to make them, even if it's for the slightest, somehow the work has to touch people and get in their consciousness and become part of them. And that's the real job of an artist. And this is the hardest thing to do, particularly in an environment now where everything is a business and everything is corporate and everything is against the artist having a real voice. Everyone's being drowned out by the next person and the next person and the next person. So in that environment, if someone like you can say, Barbara, you've done a wonderful job, that means the world to me, It's about your work getting through to people, or even if it's one photograph, one image, that's all you need, that's all the world needs, is something to hold on to that brings them beauty or provokes them or inspires them, makes them angry, makes them like and that's the job. It's a job, and you become a vessel, to share.
So what was your in terms of making a living as a photographer?
I've done everything.
Talk to me about that.
Well, I've shot weddings. I'm a very good photographer. I can photograph anything. I've done portraits. I had a dark room for many. I still do. And that's how I earned a living before I joined my first gallery. And I printed pictures for everybody, including Madonna. I can only say that doing darkroom work brings you into a different realm of experience, because you get to see what other people have done. You work on commercial jobs. You do things for yourself. You get better at printing because you've done work for other people. So that was my primary way of earning a living until I joined the gallery that I was at for 13 years, which really helped me with my income until her death. And then I started teaching and doing other things. And I've been working on these public commissions and books. So, and I keep working. I keep working.
How has because this is your third book, or is it your fourth?
Yes,
third book. Okay, so you've gotten, some acknowledgements for your work and greater awareness as a result of these books coming out. But how has the release of the books and the attention that they've gotten sort of impacted your career as just a day-to-day photographer?
Well, I think anytime you get attention for your work, that's a great thing, right? But I look at my career always just to mirror in my other book, In the Shadow of Genius. The designer of the Brooklyn Bridge didn't just design the Brooklyn Bridge. He spent a lifetime doing smaller projects that were groundbreaking and challenging, each and every one of them. So for me, I feel very much the same way, that every project that I do and every book that I do is a stepping stone to something greater. And I have, obviously probably too many projects, that I want to do, in the near future. And also, I've started to go back to something that I've done years ago before I became a photographer. I was awarded a scholarship to Florence, and I used to illustrate for a couple of magazines. So I've been getting back into my drawing, which is such a mainstay of my work as a photographer, because without that knowledge and background in art, you could never do a decent photograph. And one of my mentors, of course, is Henri Cartier-Bresson, who really spent the last days of his life drawing again in the Louvre. So I'm a very complicated photographer because my influences come from so many different places, which we could discuss it another time, maybe. I don't know.
You mentioned Bruce Davidson, who is just a marvelous photographer and talent. How'd you come to know him, and what have you valued most about your relationship with him?
Oh, well, okay. Well, I met him at the Howard Greenberg Gallery because for a short time I was represented by that gallery before I moved to the next one. And I met Bruce there at an opening. And I don't quite remember, it was a while ago, but I don't know, somehow I think I met him for coffee. I don't really know, but we started developing a friendship. And I was very clear about this relationship, that I wasn't enamored with him. I didn't want to be a clone of him. He was just sort of like what was the character in Star Wars? Yoda, right? The wise one. And I remember we used to go to the museums together and have coffee. He was big on coffee. And he would just be wise, you know? And, you know, I never really asked him for help because I didn't want that. I wanted to succeed on my own, but I only wanted to have mentors who were true to their character. And one of the things I loved about Bruce was that he was so enthusiastic about his work. And I remember at the time that I was friends with him, he was probably in his 70s or something like that. And I don't know, he used to get up at 5 a.m. and go work in the darkroom and print. And I'd say, you know, that's pretty cool. It's like, you know, you're falling out of bed into the dark room going, oh, I forgot you, just like me. He'd go back in his negatives and find things to print. And then sometimes our subject matter overlapped, and he really loved my South Street project, and he endorsed it, you know, beyond anybody. But there was this character in my book called Heshy, and he used to buy fish for the Essex Street Market. And Bruce did this piece on the garden cafeteria, which is all these old Jews that would hang out and shoot the breeze and, you know, eat borscht on the Lower East Side. And he had photos of Heshy, and I had photos of Heshy. It was hysterical. So, you know, people come into your life at certain times and they're informative and inspirational. And Bruce was one of them. And I also have a writer that I have two writers, but, Dan Barry, who did the beautiful introduction.
Oh my God, was that gorgeous?
Isn't he? He's great. I mean, how many Pulitzer Prizes is it? You know, he's just brilliant. And Philip Lopate, because in order for me to do these long-term projects, you also have to learn how to write. And that is daunting. And, you know, he has been such a great friend and such a great supporter. And he's so brilliant and he knows he used to do film criticism and art criticism and write millions of books. So I'm very blessed. And of course, my husband, Greg Curry, the sound engineer, and my son. One
of the interesting things that comes up for me about the book and the work is people's relationship to work.
Yeah.
I live in California. I live in Los Angeles. So
Yeah,
here,
okay.
your status is associated with what you do, right?
Well, I think that's in New York too, unfortunately.
Yeah. But there was an interesting thing, and I don't know if I read it in the book or some ancillary stuff when I was doing it, sort of researching it, was the idea that it's not so much what you do, but your relationship or your perception of what you're doing and how you're doing it, right? Mm-hmm. And that has much greater value than any sort of external validation that you get. And I think that's pervasive. And when I look at the photographs of the men in your book, and that being said, how do you think that observing these people working the way they did for as long as you did sort of influenced the way you look at yourself and your work?
Mm. Well, I'm assuming you're talking about the Fulton Market.
Yeah.
So, okay. Well, it's kind of simple, to answer. And that is, the question is, what is a tough guy? It's always the question. What's a tough guy? What does that mean? And then this guy, his name was Uncle Rip. Uncle Rip. He say, well, a tough guy is when he can get up in the middle of the night, go to work, and do his job. That's a tough guy. And of course, there are a lot of other definitions. So I could say the same thing about myself, that I'm a tough girl. Like I just get up and I go do what I have to do. And I do it because I love it. It's like experiencing the world, and being alive and doing all this stuff is what makes you alive. And the minute you don't want to do it anymore, that's okay too. But for me, it's the stamina, to just keep going. And that's what I think one of the elements it takes to do work that hopefully somehow, some way has meaning, Yeah.
Well, my last question that I ask each guest is I ask them to recommend another photographer for listeners to discover and explore on their own, and it can be anyone,
really?
Someone you've long admired.
Does it have to be a photographer? Or can it be an artist?
Yeah, that's fine.
I wouldn't want to recommend a photographer. You know why? Because I know too many of them. And the minute I open my mouth, I'll go, why didn't you mention me? Or why didn't you? So I would move away from that. And I will say, out of a lot of artists that I've seen, I particularly am moved by cinema. And I think Ingmar Bergman is one of my heroes. And I also have these friends in Germany, Nicholas Humbert and Simone Fierbringer, who are great independent filmmakers. But I would say Ingmar Bergman. He's got everything, and his cinematographer Sven Nydquist.
Yeah, gorgeous.
And Seventh Seal, one of my favorite movies. So you could learn everything, and also just go to the Met and stand in front of Peter Bruegel. and that's what I taught it. That's what I taught. I used to just drag people to the Met, and they go, "What are we doing here? Why aren't we looking at a picture?" I go, "You are.
Barbara, thank you so much. It was a joy to talk with you.
Oh, thank you. It was an absolute pleasure, and I thank you again. You're absolutely great.
there are a lot of podcasts out there, including some of my favorite shows on NPR, that are facing a lot of financial challenges. Shows are being canceled or being put on indefinite hiatus as podcast production companies try to figure out how to make these shows viable and profitable. Now, we're not facing such issues, but we still have our own challenges. The show is not my primary source of income, despite how much I wish it was. I do it because I love the conversations, and I know that you do too. However, putting these shows out every year costs time and it costs money. And unfortunately, our costs go up while our income sometimes decreases. Because though we do have periodic advertisers, we are primarily dependent on you, our listeners. And unfortunately, we've seen contributions decline. I know there is no shortage of people and shows asking you for money. But if this show is making a difference in your career, your art, your life, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter today. You can contribute $5, $10, $20 or more a month by visiting patreon.com/thecandidframe. We can continue to be committed to delivering a great show to you, but please show your support to the work we're doing. Again, it's patreon.com/thecandidframe. Thank you. Thanks to Barbara for joining us. Learn more about her work by visiting menschphoto.com. If you're a fan of our work, you can write reviews on whatever service you use to listen to podcasts and share a favorite episode on social networks, be it Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. Remember to use the hashtag #TheCandidFrame. You can also support us financially by contributing via PayPal or Patreon. Links are on our website. I'll be leading a hybrid street photography workshop in Los Angeles through the Los Angeles Center of Photography beginning November 1st. If you're in the area, please consider signing up by visiting lacphoto.org or clicking on the link in the show notes or the website. We've relaunched our newsletter. If you haven't received updates on everything related to TCF, including book recommendations and announcements about special events and workshops from us and some of our guests, please sign up by visiting our website. And if you can't find every episode of the show on whatever service you use to listen to podcasts, download the Candid Frame app, which is available for both Apple iOS and Android. And because of your generosity, it's free to download and use. No additional purchases are required. The Candid Frame's audio engineer is Martin Taylor, who you can find at theothermartintaylor.com. The show's senior producer is Cynthia Parker. And this is Ibarian X, and this is The Candid Frame.